On the grounds of the Catholic University of America in Washington, Ethiopian religious manuscripts are coming to life.
For nearly 2,000 years, the story of the resurrection has been presented to the world as complete, settled, and closed. In most traditions, it ends quietly: an empty tomb, a few brief appearances, a message of peace, and an ascension that lifts the narrative out of history and into doctrine. What follows is the birth of the Church, the spread of belief, and the gradual construction of religious authority. That version of events has shaped how billions of people understand faith, salvation, and spiritual responsibility. Yet history has never been as simple as that ending suggests. Far from Rome, far from the councils that defined Western Christianity, a parallel Christian tradition preserved a much longer and more demanding account of what followed the resurrection. In Ethiopia, within monasteries carved into rock and libraries guarded across generations, full resurrection passages were copied, read, and taught continuously. These were not fragments or speculative legends. They were complete texts, written in Ge'ez, Ethiopia's ancient liturgical language, and treated as essential scripture rather than optional commentary. Only recently have these passages begun to reach a wider audience through careful translation and scholarly engagement. The existence of these texts does not depend on secrecy or modern discovery. The Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church has always acknowledged them. What changed is that the rest of the world is now paying attention. To understand why these resurrection passages feel so unsettling today, it is necessary to understand how Christianity developed differently across regions. Early Christianity was not a single and uniform movement. It spread through diverse communities, each shaped by local culture, language, and political reality. Ethiopia adopted Christianity in the early 4th century, during the reign of King Ezana of Aksum, at roughly the same time that Christianity was still negotiating its status within the Roman world. Unlike Europe, Ethiopia's church did not evolve under imperial pressure to standardize doctrine for political unity. Its scripture was translated early, preserved locally, and insulated from many of the later theological debates that reshaped Western Christianity. As a result, the Ethiopian biblical canon remained broader. Depending on classification, it contains 81 or 88 books, significantly more than the Western Protestant or Catholic canons. This difference was not an accident. Ethiopian monks copied everything they received from earlier tradition, even texts that raised difficult questions or resisted simple interpretation. They believed that sacred memory should be preserved whole, not trimmed for convenience. Over centuries marked by invasions, civil conflict, drought, and isolation, these manuscripts survived because they were woven into worship, not stored as curiosities. Scientific dating has since confirmed the antiquity of Ethiopian manuscripts. Radiocarbon analysis of texts such as the Garima Gospels places them between the 4th and 7th centuries, making them among the oldest surviving Christian manuscripts in the world. In some cases, they predate European copies that later shaped Western theology. This matters because it challenges the assumption that Ethiopian texts are late or derivative. In reality, they preserve early traditions that developed alongside, not after, those in the Mediterranean world. Within this broader canon are resurrection teachings that radically expand the post-crucifixion narrative. In Western Bibles, the resurrection period is brief. In the Ethiopian tradition, it is central. The 40 days between the resurrection and the ascension are treated not as a narrative gap, but as the most intensive teaching period of Jesus' ministry. According to these texts, Jesus did not simply appear to reassure his followers before departing. He remained with them for 40 days, fully present and actively instructing them. These days were filled with warnings, explanations, and preparation for a world in which truth and deception would be difficult to distinguish. The focus was not on buildings, rituals, or institutional power. It was on the inner life of the individual and the survival of spiritual integrity in a hostile environment. The tone of these teachings is strikingly direct. Jesus speaks not of conquering nations or establishing visible authority, but of invisible forces that influence human thought and behavior. The primary struggle, he explains, is not against other people, but against deception, pride, and the misuse of power. Faith in this framework is not passive acceptance. It is active awareness. One of the most distinctive concepts in the Ethiopian resurrection passages is the idea of two opposing forces within every human being. The text describes them as two winds. One wind gives life, clarity, and moral strength. The other spreads error, corruption, and spiritual decay. These are not presented as abstract metaphors or poetic flourishes. They are described as lived realities that shape perception, decision-making, and ultimately the state of the soul. The danger, according to the text, is not sudden moral collapse, but gradual loss of awareness. A person can remain outwardly functional, respected, even religious, while inwardly disconnected. The text uses a phrase that is deliberately unsettling: the walking tomb. This is someone who continues to breathe and act, but whose inner life has become empty. The body lives, but the spirit has withered. What makes this teaching especially disruptive is what it does not offer. There is no ritual, sacrifice, or institutional authority that can automatically reverse this condition. Protection comes through vigilance, self-examination, restraint of thought and speech, and disciplined awareness. Silence is emphasized. Observation is emphasized. Responsibility is placed squarely on the individual. This framework leaves little room for blind obedience. Authority, the text warns, can disguise itself as holiness. Power can adopt religious language while serving its own interests. Faith that relies entirely on external systems becomes vulnerable to manipulation. These warnings are not framed as accusations against specific institutions. They are presented as inevitable patterns that arise whenever belief is separated from inner discernment. In this version of the resurrection, Jesus is not offering closure. He is issuing a briefing. The resurrection marks the beginning of a new phase in which followers must navigate a world where truth will be mixed with distortion, and appearances will often replace substance. The responsibility he places on his disciples is heavy. They are expected to think, observe, and guard their inner life actively. This emphasis helps explain why such texts were uncomfortable in later centuries. Societies built on hierarchy and centralized authority function more easily when faith is mediated and simplified. Teachings that empower individuals to question appearances and recognize deception undermine systems that depend on passive compliance. In that sense, the Ethiopian resurrection passages are not radical because they introduce new doctrine, but because they preserve an older expectation of spiritual maturity. The texts also reveal a surprisingly practical dimension. Jesus' instructions are not mystical abstractions detached from daily life. They are grounded in behavior, how people speak, how they respond to temptation, how they treat power, and how they maintain awareness in ordinary moments. Faith becomes a discipline rather than a declaration. Some passages align unexpectedly with modern scientific understanding. References to hidden waters beneath the Earth echo discoveries of vast water reservoirs deep within the planet's mantle. Descriptions of winds moving through defined pathways across the sky resonate with what is now known about global atmospheric circulation. These parallels do not imply advanced scientific knowledge in the modern sense, but they demonstrate careful observation of natural systems and an attempt to integrate them into a broader understanding of order and balance. More importantly, the texts consistently warn against complacency. They describe a future in which images replace understanding, repetition replaces reflection, and authority goes unquestioned because it feels familiar. Truth, they suggest, will not disappear. It will be buried under noise. This is one reason these resurrection passages feel uncomfortably relevant today. Modern societies are saturated with information, images, and competing narratives. The challenge is no longer access to knowledge, but discernment. The Ethiopian texts demand exactly that: attention, patience, and responsibility for one's own inner state. The question naturally arises: why are these translations gaining attention now? Ethiopian monks did not suddenly decide to invent new scripture. These texts have existed for centuries. What has changed is the broader cultural context. Trust in institutions, religious, political, and informational, has declined globally. Many people are searching for forms of spirituality that emphasize direct understanding rather than mediated authority. Some Ethiopian scholars suggest that earlier generations believed the world was not ready for these teachings. Others argue that nothing has changed except accessibility. Translation, digitization, and global communication have made it possible for texts once confined to mountain monasteries to circulate widely. There is no formal announcement, no institutional campaign. The material is emerging quietly through academic work and independent publication. What these resurrection passages ultimately challenge is not history, but expectation. They do not deny the crucifixion or resurrection. They do not replace the Gospels. They complicate them. They insist that resurrection is not only about life after death, but about how to live before it. They move the focus from belief as comfort to belief as responsibility. In this tradition, resurrection is not an ending sealed at an empty tomb. It is an ongoing process of awakening, vigilance, and moral clarity. The story does not lift humanity out of history. It pushes humanity deeper into it, with eyes open. Ethiopian monks preserved these texts not to shock the world, but because they believed truth should outlast power. They copied them because they found them necessary, not because they anticipated future controversy. The discomfort these passages create today may be the very reason they endured. The resurrection story most people know is neat, contained, and reassuring. The Ethiopian resurrection passages are none of those things. They are demanding. They place the burden of awareness back where it began, within the human heart. If the resurrection was meant to awaken responsibility rather than provide closure, then these texts do not change history by adding something new. They change it by restoring what was never meant to be forgotten.